So we've got Giles Turnbull here, which is very exciting. So Giles has written Agile Comms Handbook. I have a copy. I think Maddie did. Do you have a copy, Maddie? You've always got a copy of every book that's ever on a thing. You don't know. I should buy you a copy, which is there. So for those of you who have not looked at it or don't know much about what Giles does, the book is all about working in the open, which is something that I'm really keen on, really passionate about. And for me, I think is one of the fundamentals of digital change and culture change in organisations, and as a move away from the kind of bad old days of squirreling everything away and then trying to announce it in a press release 12 months down the line and pretending everything was fine, everything wasn't fine. Your board never knows what you're doing because you don't explain it until 12 months down the line. Other teams have no idea what you're doing if you don't explain it until 12 months down the line. And actually that idea of transparency, and I think for me, the thing that's really important in the book, I'm sure Giles will touch on this and it won't be too much of a spoiler, is moving away from the notion that open working means that you have to talk about everything all the time. And actually you can be quite selective about that. So we're not talking about opening everything up. You can be fairly selective within that process. I'm sure Giles will touch on that when we come in. Just as a bit of background, Giles, I always think it's interesting that you were the first internet correspondent of the Press Association. I always think that's quite interesting. You're also one of, I don't know how many government digital service people we've had in calls now. We've had Sarah Richards on, or Sarah Winters now, and a few others as well. So I'll hand over to Giles. We've got a presentation first. I will not mention startled horses anymore, and then we'll get cracking and we'll have a chance for Q&A. And also, not enough of you got your cameras on. I need to look at your houses. So turn your cameras on, please. Right, I'll hand over to Giles.
Okay, thank you, Ross. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Can you give me 10 seconds to do some clicking about? I'm going to show you some slides, and hopefully we will have some fun. And hopefully you should now see me on top of my slides. Yes, thank you for the thumbs up. And so that you don't end up seeing two of me, I'm going to switch off my Zoom video, and now you should only be subjected to the one of me. I'm going to talk for a little while, 20-25 minutes or so, and then we will have questions. And I will rattle through these fairly quickly. Don't worry if it feels really fast, and if you're missing bits, you can always watch the recording later. You can always read the book, because basically this is a bit of the book, but in speech form. I'm Giles. I help organizations communicate more like humans. I have a website at usethehumanvoice.com. Use the Human Voice is my company that I set up. And this is the book that I wrote, the Agile Comms Handbook. You can buy it at agilecommshandbook.com. It's 15 squids plus a little bit extra for shipping. I used to work for the government back in the day. I suspect quite a lot of you have done or do or will do at some point in the future. And things like talking about gov.uk, I'm sure will be familiar to you, especially if people like Sarah Winters have been previous guests in this slot. Gov.uk was famously an effort to take literally hundreds, it was 1,882, if I remember rightly, government websites that all looked different, all worked different, they were all funded differently, they were all commissioned differently, and turn them into one, which you will probably be familiar with. And of course, that work has been quite influential and has gone on to influence other organizations, other governments in other places. The team that was doing that work was guided by a set of fairly simple principles, which still exist today. They have been iterated slightly since they looked like this, but the government design principles, as they are now known, were a way of guiding and shaping everybody's work at GDS. And I was on the team that was mainly focused on principle number 10, make things open, it makes things better. That was what we were there to achieve. And in order to do that, we wrote hundreds, thousands probably of blog posts. We organized events. We made videos and stuck them up on YouTube. We wrote lots of little bits of micro copy and stickers and catchphrases and posters and things like that. This is one of the posters that I was most pleased with being part of, which was a poster we wrote explaining to newcomers in the organization about the things that it was okay to do when you started working at GDS. And effectively, this poster was a list of things that it was nice to know on your first day, but that it was nobody's job to tell you about. We wrote this list, we stuck it up on the wall. It was quite influential. It's been another idea that has been copied and borrowed and remixed by all sorts of other organizations. Most recently among those, Google, who did a version of this, which looks very similar. They used almost exactly the same colors, but they changed some of the words to make it a bit more googly. So in the spirit of that poster, and given that it is 10:10 on a Friday morning, please, as far as I'm concerned, it is totally okay for you to have a cup of tea, because it is essentially 11s. I've got one here, it's getting cold. And it's okay to do all of these things as far as I'm concerned, including leave early, because I know everyone is busy. So let's move on to the useful bit, which is I've plucked out from the book, I've plucked out 5 tips for doing Agile comms. And I am literally just skimming a stone across the surface here. There is not going to be a lot of detail, but there is some detail in the book. Tip number 1 is look for things in your organization that need more layers of explanation. What do I mean by that? I start the book with this hypothesis that everyone is already too busy most of the time. And I bang on for about half a page about how everybody's calendar is just insane these days. And that's sort of normal, that's everywhere. And there are consequences to this reality. And one of those consequences is that if you share the detail of your work as the first thing that you share, then people are less likely to have time and inclination to pay attention to it. And that's difficult for all of us, because the detail is there. It exists by default. It's already part of what we do. In fact, it usually is the output. It's the work. And it exists because we're all here to make it happen. But those additional layers of content, what I call the context layer and the lure layer, they don't always exist by default. Quite often there is some context stuff, not always. There are very rarely any lures in place when there need to be. You don't always need one, but when you do and it's missing, there's a problem. And one of the issues here is that in many organizations, creating those additional layers is not part of anyone's job. It isn't anybody's specific responsibility to make sure that they're there. So this is tip number 1, is to look around you in your organization, look around you for things that other people need to know and understand that are mainly made of detail, and ask yourselves or ask your colleagues, do we need additional layers of stuff on top? And if so, who's going to make them? Who's going to create them? How are we going to create them? And how are we going to iterate them? And so on. So that's tip number 1. Look out for those things and see what you can do about them. Tip number 2 is my favorite one, which is to start experimenting with bad first drafts. I have another hypothesis, which is this, that all first drafts are bad drafts, but that's the thing that makes them good. And when I'm talking about a draft, I mean the writing of anything, really. And that includes the making of videos. You know, the first rough cut of a video is a bad video, but it helps you make a better one. But there are consequences and there are good things about adopting this principle and making it part of your daily routine. Because if you accept that all first drafts are bad, it gives you special superpowers. Talking of superpowers, this is not in the book. You can, if you don't believe me about bad first drafts, think about one of the best-selling books of all time, The Lord of the Rings. Apologies to anybody watching this who has either never read the book or never seen any of the movies. For you people, I'm afraid the next few slides will make slightly less sense. But anyway, trust me, if you haven't read the book or watched the movies, there are small people called hobbits who have to take a magical ring and throw it into a volcano. Okay, there you go. This is the magical ring. These are some of the hobbits. And in the book, as those of us who've seen the film and read the book will know, the hero is called Frodo. His friends are called Sam and Pippin and Merry, and they are guided by Aragorn and Gandalf. the heroic hero and the wizard with the magical staff. But of course, Tolkien was writing in longhand on paper, and he kept all his first drafts, all his early material was kept. And then years and years later, his children and grandchildren went through it all and republished some of it so that we know about some of that background. We know about some of the early versions that Tolkien wrote and then abandoned. And consequently, we know that there was a time when Frodo was called Bingo, and Sam was called Frodo, and Aragorn was called Trotter, and so on and so on. And I'm really glad that Tolkien changed his mind, because having a ring bearer called Bingo just wouldn't work, in my opinion. So another thing about these early drafts that Tolkien was doing is that right at the beginning, when he started writing the book, there wasn't even a magical ring. When he started writing, he effectively was sending the small hobbits off on another quest, but he didn't know why. And he got a few chapters in before he realized, hang on, there's no point to this. There's no purpose. Why are these hobbits going on this quest? I don't know. So he went back again. He looked at his early material. He looked at the book that he'd written before, The Hobbit, and he thought, wait a minute, what if the ring in The Hobbit that makes you go invisible was also like evil and stuff? Let's do something with that. And that's how the Lord of the Rings would end up being created. Now, the thing about this technique to writing is that it's really good to copy, and I do it all the time. I am constantly writing things that I only have the vaguest clue about. And this is a typical scene that I have recreated from me using Google Docs. I am very often writing bad first drafts, making them really, really awful, leaving huge gaping holes in them, sometimes even deliberately writing fiction where I don't know the facts. And I write a bit of fiction, I literally make something up, and then I add a comment like this saying, I don't know what I'm doing, or I have made this up, please help me make it actual reality, and so on. This is a really good technique because it helps you get stuff out. It helps you get a basic version out of your brain and onto the page. And if it's okay for Tolkien to do this, I think it's okay for all of us to do this. And I have a really, a quote that I am very fond of from an American author called Shannon Hale, who said this: when I'm writing a first draft, I'm just putting sand into a bucket so I can build the sandcastle later. Keep this in mind when you're writing your first drafts, and you will write more drafts faster, more often. And that's a good thing, because that means you get your ideas out of your brain, you get them down on a page, and you can rework them into something better. Another tip is to collect things to show. Those of you who have been part of or adjacent to the world of digital government comms over the last decade or so may have seen or heard this catchphrase. This was another one of the posters that we made at GDS that said, show the thing. And the idea here was that when teams at GDS were communicating about work, they would show the work. And that was true irrespective of the purpose of the communication. Sometimes, often in fact, the purpose of the communication was to get approval from above. It was to get an okay from a senior stakeholder. And teams were encouraged to put their prototypes on a laptop and stick it in front of someone important, like a minister, and say, here you go, minister, have a go at trying out our new prototype. That's showing the thing. But also showing the thing is also making videos about it, or making screen shares, or doing demos in person, but without the recipient being the driver of the computer, and so on. So show the thing was really important, but it's really hard if you don't have a collection of things to show when the time comes. So get into the habit as a team of gathering stuff and putting it somewhere. This is a folder on my Mac where I do exactly this. I have a bunch of folders like this, and I take loads of screenshots. When there aren't pandemics happening, I take loads of photos of people in offices and sticky notes on walls and all of that stuff, and I save it away. 90% of it never sees the light of day again. But then in the future, when I do have to write something about a piece of work, I know that I've got some useful illustrative material already saved. And future me is grateful to past me for saving these things in a folder. So make this a habit, make this something that everybody on the team does by default. Another one is about slides and presentations. In the book, I talk about two different kinds of presentations. There's the kind like I'm doing now, where it's me talking to an audience of people, whether this is in a room face-to-face or over a Zoom call, it doesn't really matter. But this is one type of presentation and the slides need to reflect that. And this is what I call a type 1. It's a presentation designed to be presented. But at the same time, a lot of people use PowerPoint or Keynote or other tools like that to make presentations, as in PPTX files, that they send to people to read. So you will often end up with slides that look more like this. And these slides have a different purpose. They meet a different user need. This is what I would call a type 2 presentation. It is a presentation designed to be read. And the biggest problem that I ever encounter in all organizations, large and small, is people using slides they've written for one type to do the other type's job. In other words, people using one of these to do the other one, or the other one to do the first one. And this is one of the most important things that I think makes communication better in most organizations, is understanding that there are these two different varieties of presentation. And when you've got one, let's say you've got a type 2, which is designed to be read, and then you realize that you have to actually stand in front of an audience and present about the same topic, what that means is you're going to have to create an additional type 1 presentation. You're going to have to put the effort in to make another set of slides about the same thing. And if you've been collecting things and you have loads of images, that job will be much, much easier. So think about user needs for your presentations too. What are you actually doing when you're making a presentation, as in a PPTX file? Are you writing something that you're going to email to somebody and say, please read this? In which case, yes, you can have a series of slides with structured thoughts on them, and that's useful for some people. Or are you going to be presenting in front of an audience? In which case, you really want people to be paying attention to what comes out of your mouth, and in which case your slides need to be more illustrative than anything else. There is loads more about presentations in two places. There is a website that I made with some friends a few years ago called doingpresentations.com. It won't win any prizes for design because I'm not a designer, so it looks awful, but it is quite readable. And another one that just came out a few weeks ago is this book by my former boss, Russell Davis. He has written a book called Everything I Know About Life I Learned from PowerPoint, and it is an excellent read. It's very funny. It's also very, very useful. If you want to get better at doing presentations, read that book and check out that website. Okay, one more tip. You only need to be a tiny bit creative to stand out from the crowd. This is an idea I got from a developer called Simon Willison. He's a Brit, but he lives in the States. And earlier this year, he was hiring people to join his company. And he wrote this blog post that says it doesn't take much public creativity to stand out as a job candidate. And he's absolutely right. He was saying here that the CVs that were coming into him for these jobs that he was hiring for, the ones that had just a tiny sprinkling of extra creativity in them, those were the ones he was drawn to. But it didn't take much creativity, just a little tiny bit. And that applies exactly the same way in communication, whether you're communicating internally or externally about something big or small, especially if you're creating additional layers of content on top of the detail and you need a lure of some sort, then you need some creativity, not a lot, but a little bit. Let me show you an example of the kind of creativity that I mean. I bank with Monzo, and they are one of those banks these days that they're just an app on your phone. They don't have any branches on the street. And Monzo sent out an email earlier this year about terms and conditions. Now, everybody says that they never read terms and conditions. And everybody says that they always tick the box that says, I have read the terms and conditions. And the same applies to emails about the terms and conditions. Very rarely will most people bother to pay attention to those emails. But this one came from Monzo, and I did pay attention to it because it was so well written. And it included this line, we'll refund you for loss or damage in some cases, but not others. We know that's vague, sorry. What we are and aren't responsible for is quite fiddly to explain in this email. I think that that paragraph is a work of genius because it does so many things in one go. It is lively and creative because it uses language like quite fiddly, which is very human sort of language. So that makes it more approachable and understandable and accessible, but also it generates trust. It makes me think, you know what, Monzo, I trust you. I'm not going to bother reading the changes to the terms and conditions because I know you're treating me like a human and like an adult. It's fine. So it builds up that trust. And at the same time, it's just got that tiny little sprinkling of creativity on top of something that for most organizations would be really dull and boring. Okay, I have rambled on for quite enough, I think. It's time to listen to you lot and answer some questions. If you want to buy the book, agilecomshandbook.com is the place to go. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for inviting me to come along. I will switch off this jiggery pokery now and we can have a chat.
Thanks, Giles. That was wonderful. Loads of really interesting points there, and I'm sure there'll be some questions coming soon. I think one theme we saw early on in the chat was about this like hesitancy about working in the open. So like that kind of getting over the fear factor. A few people posted about that. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to chip in with a thought here, then please do. My question back is, what is the fear of? What fear exists? Is it fear of saying something you shouldn't? Is it fear of saying something when it hasn't been approved by above, by the powers that be? Is it fear of being open because you might be too open? I'm not sure what the fear is of. And to be honest, I think the fear varies from organization to organization and team to team. I'm just looking at the chat. Fear of looking stupid, says somebody, often a question of confidence. Yes, yeah, I can understand that. You won't look stupid because actually in every circumstance I can ever think of, the fact that you are opening up what it does is it generates more trust. And I can give you an example of this from a team I've been working with in government in DEFRA. It's the Future Farming team. So their job is they are doing something about the fact that we've left the European Union and therefore there's going to be no more funding for farmers from the EU. So the Future Farming Programme is an effort by DEFRA to do something about that and create ways to send funding to farmers who are going to be losing it from the EU. The communication there is huge. It is a massive job. It's really tricky because the farmers are quite worried. So it's an exercise in reassurance as much as anything else. And the fact that the program have been so open about their work and about what they don't know as much as what they do know has in fact earned them an enormous amount of trust among the farming community. A community which incidentally at the beginning of this was very distrustful of DEFRA as an organization. But the Future Farming leadership have gone out of their way to open up to the community they are there for and admit in public, we don't know everything. We are still learning. We've got 7 years to make this transition because that's what's happened. And we are learning as we go and we will publish what we learn. So the act of being open and the act of confessing that they don't have all the answers at the beginning has actually been a benefit for them. Is that vaguely relevant and helpful? I think so, I hope so.
Yeah, I think that's really useful, Giles. Just, I mean, it's to reflect, because we've been doing some work with charities funded through the lottery, and one of the conditions of grant on a programme was that they had to work in the open, and most of them embraced it, but actually what we found was someone was maybe the manager of that project or service, and it was someone like their chief exec who was the one that was saying, actually, we don't work in the open because we don't have any control over that, or the thing's not finished yet. Why would we possibly talk about the thing when it's not finished? And I think particularly in the charity sector, that's a thing people are going to hit quite a lot, is there's good intentions and people who want to do this stuff transparently, but there's someone else on a board or a senior management team who is terrified at the prospect of this. I think I'd be interested to know like your kind of thoughts on how you alleviate that fear at a senior level.
Yeah. And you alluded to this in your intro, Ross, and I didn't end up covering it, so I should now. This point about the idea of working in the open, meaning that you don't have to open up about everything. You don't have to bare your soul. What you do is you get an opportunity to be your own editor. In the book, I compare this to the DVD extras that you used to get on the end of a DVD back in 1,000 years ago when DVDs were relevant. And those DVD extras would usually include a blooper reel, wouldn't they, of mistakes that they made while they were doing the film. But that reel would be, what, 2 or 3 minutes long? It was always the best bloopers, the funniest bloopers. But it wasn't by any means all of the bloopers, because most of them are probably quite dull and quite boring and not very funny. So what they did to make the blooper reels was they edited and they extracted out the best bits and turned them into a blooper reel. The same applies to working in the open. You don't have to say everything. What you can do is you can choose what to say. And you can say, okay, we've been working on this particular project. This is a common scenario. We have a prototype, or we have some early research, or we have, we've done a certain amount of work, maybe 4 weeks, maybe 2 months worth or something like that. And we know we've learned something so far. And this is something that I'm often encouraging teams to do is, if you're stuck writing a blog post, well, start with what you've learned recently. Doesn't matter if you don't share everything that you've learned, but even if you only share one thing, that's better than not sharing anything at all. So one of the things I often say to leaders, like the one you just hypothesized about, Ross, is you're not opening up everything, but you can find things. It's always possible to find something that you can open up about and share the fact that you're, for example, learning as you go along, because the act of doing that doesn't actually make you look stupid. It doesn't make you look ill-informed. It makes you look participative. It makes you look collaborative, because you're saying in the open, this is what we're learning. And you are proving that you are an organization or a team who are capable of learning. What better way to prove that than by publishing about it?
I wonder if I can chip in with one funny story about a bad first draft. It's like probably the most extreme bad first draft experience I've had, where a long time ago I was managing a design and print team, and we were doing a new approach on a trustee report and accounts, so a big document for the organization. We did some new creative stuff, and we asked the team member to share an early draft for the head of finance and say, what do you think of this? And shared it, and it seemed fine. And then the designer sent it off to print, but it was at a massively early stage with like Laura Mipsum text and funny figures in. And the finance team were totally spitting rivets, said, how on earth did this ever get out the door? The guy said, well, look, I emailed the guy. He said it was fine. So I sent it off to print. So it was like, yeah, so we had to do some furious backpedaling. But for me, that was an interesting lesson in like signaling what stage is this at. So you sort of, what we should have done is been like absolutely crystal clear and said, this is so you can look at the design, it's not the final document. And I think maybe something around this, I know somebody pointed out there's a worry somebody might just jump in and start to rewrite kind of word by word at this stage. So it's like having that kind of sticker on the top that says, this is the earliest idea. What do you think?
Yeah. We could probably do a whole extra DigiShift session just about sending things to print, because it is a whole different kettle of ball games.
Yeah.
Yeah, that point you just made there about sharing draft content appropriately. I always do this when I've written a draft and I'm sharing it with somebody. I always put particularly if I'm sharing it with a very busy senior leader type person, because usually that's the type of person who hasn't been well informed about the progress so far. They just know that at some point they should expect to see a document from someone like me. So when I share it, I will often put in huge letters at the top of the email, this is a first draft, we can change it. And then another thing I say to them is, please don't edit. I don't want these senior people to open Word and start typing, because that just takes us down the wrong path. What I want them to do is open Word or whatever it is, read the draft, and then ideally talk to me, phone me up or arrange a Zoom call or something like that, and say either, yes, I love it, but let's change X, Y, and Z, or I hate every single word of it, let's scrap it and start again. I don't mind which one of those it is, to be honest, but the verbal feedback on the big idea is much, much more useful at early draft stage than the detailed feedback in the side of a Word document, where you end up just drowning in Word comments, and people are, when a whole bunch of people pile into one Word document and you end up with 100 comments, some of them are about big idea structural stuff, and quite a lot of them are usually about semicolons and spelling mistakes. And let's fix that little stuff later. Let's fix the big idea stuff earlier.
Giving me cold sweats just thinking about the amount of comments that I've had.
It's really dispiriting.
Yeah, Una's made a really interesting point, which I guess is about asynchronous and remote working, which is about communication style. Do you want to say any more about that, Una, or is it just as you've noted it there? Some people might not feel go.
Yeah, it's just exactly what you said. The remote working is causing more issues in communication, I think, because these differences in style. Yesterday I had a Zoom call with somebody. We went through a report we were doing. We finished it on the call.
Yeah,
easy.
That's really productive.
But that worked with that person. Other times you get this back and forward with emails and they don't want to pick up the phone to you. And that's really difficult when the styles don't match.
Yeah, it's like there's just that bit more friction around having a call or face-to-face, which you wouldn't have if you were in the same office, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you said earlier on that Sarah Winters, previously Sarah Richards, had been one of the speakers at one of these events. And in her book, which I've also got a copy of here, Sarah's book, you can read about her approach to pair writing, which I think is tremendously useful for so many different circumstances. And yeah, good point that it doesn't always work because of the writing, because the style or the approach of the individuals concerned is so different. This is another opportunity, though, to use bad drafts as a tool for getting people to say what they really think. And sometimes I've done that as well in the past. I have deliberately made my bad draft even worse so that I can send it to someone and say, look, this is the best you're going to get out of me today. If you want to make this better, and I know that you do, let's have a conversation and let's verbally try and outline what we want to say, something that you're happy with, and then leave it to me and I can rewrite it and make it into something better. Yes, Tom is saying there in the comments, pair writing is an amazing tactic. I agree. It always works, even though sometimes it feels like pulling teeth, but it usually doesn't feel like that.
I wonder if there's something about a kind of teamwork approach, because I think a lot of people maybe subconsciously with written stuff get stuck in a bit of a kind of school mentality of, I've got to write my essay, then somebody's going to mark it, and there's kind of one shot.
Yeah.
And so that makes people keep it under wraps until it's later in the day. But I think because you obviously, Giles, have that journalism background, which is much more about, there's a lot of people involved right through, and nobody's there thinking, I'm going to write a perfect 500-word blog straight off the bat on my own. There's a bit of readiness to collaborate.
And this is, again, is why I put so much emphasis on bad first drafts, because when you have a team who have adopted this, the concept removes pressure from everybody's shoulders. So it means that if you are happy writing something that you know is a bad first draft and that you know that your colleagues know is a bad first draft, that makes it easier for you to share it with them. And I always say, write your bad first draft and share it with wild abandon, share it with as many people as you can. But with that caveat, don't edit. Instead, give me feedback. Tell me what's wrong with the big picture stuff. Tell me, is the logic wrong? Is the structure wrong? Am I barking up completely the wrong tree? Sometimes I've even said to people, give me feedback, but only one sentence worth, to make them focus on the most important problem that they see in that bad first draft. But at a team level, yes, I think the more that you can get a team adopting bad first drafts for everybody on the team, it makes it easier to share, because you can say, right, everyone, here's a draft that I literally wrote on the bus, on my phone, on the way into the office this morning. It's full of mistakes. I know that it doesn't end well, but please tell me what you think of it so far. And for example, yeah, just give me one sentence worth or one bullet points worth of feedback. Because at this point, what you're really looking for is someone to just say, yes, we should definitely write something about that. That is more helpful feedback, because then at least you know that the idea as a whole is an idea worth chasing. And then you can automatically, then you can be more confident about any drafts that follow. Do we have any more questions?
I'm just going to skim back through the chat a bit in case there's one early one that's popped in, I think.
While we're doing that, I think like just that point there from Giles is like the amount of board meetings I've been at, or like senior management meetings, and it's like people don't want to deal with the big issue that's in front of them, so then they deviate to dealing with like the font that's been used or the typo that they've spotted, because that gives them some confidence that they've done something.
Yeah,
and they've not done anything.
Yeah, it's kind of frightening when that happens.
Yeah, Catherine's had a great thought there, which is about being really explicit and saying this is a bad draft session. So like, Catherine, were you thinking of people working at the same time, or that there's that stage that everybody is, this is the bad first draft?
Yeah, I mean, you could do either, I guess. Like the group could either do their own first draft, so you get the nuances of different people's perspectives on what you were meant to be writing, and then you can see where the differences are. Or you could do one person brings a bad draft, and then you kind of tear it apart.
Yeah, yeah. I like the idea of having a little collaborative session that may or may not work for different teams and different people. Definitely try it. I really like the sound of it. Most of my bad first drafts appear in my head when I am out walking, or when I borrow a neighbour's dog. Don't have my own dog. Tried walking my cat.
I know that you borrow the dog.
And or when I'm in the shower. Basically, walking or in the shower are the best places for bad first drafts. But also, I've noticed in the past bad ideas for bad first drafts popping into my head when I'm sitting in a meeting and I'm listening to lots of other people talking about a particular thing. And even then I might write maybe 3 or 4 sentences on a sticky note, one sentence per sticky, and then hold them up in the meeting and say, well, if we were going to communicate about this, we could start with a paragraph about this, followed by a paragraph about that, and finish up talking about this thing here. And that's a bad first draft as well. Getting that high level feedback about the idea first.
Okay.
Oh, Susie's muted herself. I think she works in like a taxi office. I don't know what was going on there. It's a very kind of heavy CD radio vibe about it.
Yeah.
There you go. There was a good question actually from Simon there about is the lure the why. I quite like that question.
Ah, yes. Nice. Yes, good one. So the lure is a beckoning finger, right? Go back to the first hypothesis that I was talking about, which is that everybody is already too busy most of the time. I invite any of you to look at your work calendar and tell me that that's not true, because I believe it to be true, right? Every organization I have ever worked with is full of people whose calendars are pretty much chock-a-block. So if you are communicating to somebody, it doesn't matter whether they're in your own organization or a different one, or if they are a member of the public, whoever it is, they are busy. You have to acknowledge that other people are already busy and their brains are already full of stuff. So how do you make busy people pay attention to you and your thing? How do you do that? What you do is you borrow ideas from the world of advertising. Russell Davies, whose book I was recommending a little while ago, who I worked with in government, he came from a background in advertising, and he was really good at creating lures, beckoning fingers that invite people in, that make people, they give people a reason to pay attention to you. So that's what the lure is. It is something to make busy people pay attention to you and your thing. That's why you also need a tiny sprinkling of creativity, particularly in lures, because what are the adverts that work the best? What adverts actually make you buy things? They're the ones that are going to be more creative, more lively, more interesting. You don't need a lot of creativity, but a little bit is a really good idea. And making that lure, making something that gives somebody whose calendar is already chock-a-block a good reason to turn their head in your direction and say, wait a minute, maybe there's something over here that I should pay attention to. Maybe I want to find out a little bit more about this. Quite often you will need to then tailor the lure to meet the needs of a particular audience. Maybe you only want to capture one person's attention. Maybe you need a lure just for that one person, and it's different from all the other lures that you're creating. The circumstances will be constantly changing, but that's what the lure is for. And I didn't also talk much about the context layer, the one in the middle. The context layer is usually the thing that gives people just enough information. And the way I always define it is that a good bit of context content means that at the end of reading it, when I've finished reading it, or if it's a video, when I've finished watching it, as a user, I should be in a position to answer this question. Have I had enough, or do I want to know more? And if I have had enough, it's because I know enough. I've been informed sufficiently. I know the basics. That's what a context layer of content does. It gives me just enough to know the basics. And probably for most people, it means that's fine. That's all I need. I can go now. But it also provides a pathway, a route into the detail. And these days, most of those routes are links on the internet. The context is something short and snappy and readable, and probably no more than about 400 words or 2 minutes of video. And there's a link with it, and it takes you to more detail for the people who want it. Rambling a lot this morning. Do apologize for that. Need some
No,
water.
it's fine. Thank you. I think another Catherine was kind of wondering about any tips for getting people on the mistakes train before it pulls into good draft town, which I thought was a lovely image.
I think some of that has just been answered by your lure, actually, Giles. I think.
Okay.
Great, cool. So we've covered that, but yeah.
Another tip, though, for that is to get people on the mistakes train is to lead by example. And if you are in a leadership position in an organization, to also adopt first bad drafts and use that and share your first bad draft downwards with your team. That is a tremendously powerful thing to do, because when the whole organization sees a leader doing that, then it instantly becomes okay for everyone to do it.
Great point. I've worked in places where some senior leaders did that, and that was really empowering, because then you see stuff earlier. These people can jump in, and I think it does have that effect of like people see that example and follow it.
Yeah.
Anthony, you've got a hand up.
Hey, Giles, thank you so much. It's really, really interesting. And I'm completely new to your work, so forgive me if I ask a question that you've answered hundreds of times in the past. I'm part of a new comms team in an organization that's been around for a while. And I've noticed the trait, being there for about a year now, and there's this trait of using overly formal language. And I think this is a huge barrier to iteration, creativity, not least because brevity is nowhere to be found. And so I just wanted to get your perspective on that and maybe a few tips for creating change.
Oh, yes. There's a bit in the book where I tell a story about when I started work at a particular government department, and there were induction materials to read. Lots and lots and lots of induction materials. So I opened them up in Word or something, and I did the word count thing. And the total amount that you were expected to read at this organization was about, I think the number was 80,000 words, which is a decent sized novel. And my point to the senior management almost instantly in my first week was, do you seriously expect your newcomers to read a novel in their first week here, when their calendars are already filling up with 1,000 meetings because everybody's too busy already? So the point I'm trying to make here is tying the communication to the user need. That's point number one. And this emphasis on formality that you talk about, there is a space, there is a correct way to use formal language. Formality has its place, but that doesn't mean that everything that an organization writes down needs to be written in a formal way. And it also doesn't mean that you can't be a little bit creative and interesting as you write it. Because ultimately your goal is to communicate, right? You want to get ideas into people's brains. How do you do that? By writing things down in a way that is accessible and readable and interesting. If you want people to read something, give them something that's readable. And people say to me, but we want to sound official. And I say, okay, yes, you want to sound official, but that doesn't mean that you should come across as officious. They're not the same thing. You can still be official and be fun. And for an example of that, I point to publications of note, like the Financial Times or the Economist, right? They're like the most highbrow news publications that you can get in the UK. But if you stop to read the Financial Times and the Economist, they are full of jokes, especially the Economist. They go mad with the puns and the ridiculous, that they take the mickey out of world leaders. Sometimes they are quite rude, but they're doing it because they want to put across serious ideas and they want to get information into their reader's brain. And the Economist is not afraid of making a joke about serious official things. And it is still seen, it is still acknowledged as a publication of record. So is the Financial Times, but both of them are particularly well written and particularly well edited. And when you dive into their pages, there is quite a lot in there that will make you smile or giggle or laugh. And that's a good thing, because that is the stuff that will stay in people's minds. There's another example of this. Someone I know went to a conference and watched a talk where the speaker was showing lots of data on the slides, lots of numbers for about 20 minutes. And then there was a slide about how the speaker's mum got delayed in a taxi or something like that. I can't remember anyway, you don't need to know the details. Afterwards, my friend was talking to the speaker, and the speaker said, which bit of my presentation did you remember? Do you remember any of the numbers on the slides? And my friend said, no. And the speaker said, do you remember what happened to my mum in the taxi? Oh, yeah, I can tell you that story. There you go. That's it in a nutshell. People respond to stories, they listen to stories, and they remember the stories. So the more you can make your communication sound like stories, the more likely it is that the message will get through and stay in there. So I would say to your bosses, what do they want? What are they trying to achieve? Do they want to get information into people's heads, or do they just want to sound official? There are two different paths to go down, and you know which one I will be sending them on.
I love that idea of Anthony just going back to his boss and just going, what do you want? What do you actually want?
Yeah.
A common occurrence. Thanks very much.
Okay,
Any
so
other questions, John, that have appeared in the chat?
Ellie's made a great, really interesting point, which is often a bad first draft can be really long, and that can be challenging. And
Yes.
any tips?
Yes, a top tip for that one is, first of all, write away from a computer. So step away from your laptop and go for a walk. Take a notebook with you. Don't even take your phone, and talk out loud into thin air until you say something that makes sense, and scribble that down. All you need is 5 or 6 of those, and that's a good first draft. If you do have to tie yourself to a computer, forcing yourself to only do bullet points is another one. Or writing your first draft over a coffee with a colleague, with some sticky notes between you, where you basically have a conversation and you say, okay, if we together we're going to write something about this topic, what would the first paragraph be about? Sticky note for that. Bang. What would the second paragraph be about? Sticky note for that. Maybe these are already in the wrong order. Let's swap them round. Something like that. One of the best ways to avoid waffle is to not give your fingers the opportunity to type it. So step away from computers, write somewhere else.
Great idea. There's a few really good comments coming in, so I'm going to fire a few more your way, if that's all right. So
yep.
We had a really good one from Rachel, which I suppose is about faux chumminess. So that problem of where a brand that isn't really a friend, using language that applies over familiarity, and I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yes, and so yeah, we all know those brands that want to be your mate, and I don't think that you have to sound like that in order to sound human. There is a sliding scale here. There is not an on or off switch. So that example from Monzo that I was showing you, that's more towards the I'm your mate scale, but it's not right over at the innocent smoothies end of it. It's not gone that far. It's more sort of slightly towards the middle. I think there are different, this is a shades of grey answer. And frankly, this is the kind of thing where having a team to help you edit is a really good idea, because you can start with bad first drafts. They might be too much towards one end or the other. It might be too official and officious, or they might be far too over-friendly. But using the feedback from your colleagues, getting everyone involved in the edit, sharing with wild abandon, will help you find the right point on that scale where you all think, yeah, that sounds accessible, it sounds human, but it's not like, I want to be your friend. It doesn't have to be like that. Another thing to remember is the simplicity of language doesn't necessarily mean being friendly. Gov.uk is famously written for a reading age of 9. So all the content on gov.uk uses, as far as possible, very simple words and short sentences, but it's not written at that one end of the scale. It's not written to be friendly, it's written to be understandable. And those are different things.
Great. Is it all right if I skip to another just to make sure we get, because they're really, really good ones. So Cassie's asked a brilliant one, which is, how do you tackle giving someone feedback on their draft who doesn't want it or ignores your suggestions? I suppose that's like doubling down on a bad draft and saying, okay.
Yeah. It's hard to give people feedback if they don't want it. And if they don't want it, then I don't know. They might not have shared it. The way that the thing that has worked well for me is to share the first drafts in the world that I want to see the rest of the team sharing. So I have been unafraid of sharing things and saying, look, this might be complete gubbins. Please, team, I'm trusting you to help me here. So I have opened up early on and shared lots of early drafts and been completely happy when the team says to me, nah, Giles, what are you thinking about, mate? Throw it away, which happens. And that's fine. And the worlds of journalism and novel writing are founded on this principle that you need many minds to turn bad words into good words. And anybody who has worked in those professional fields of writing knows how good it is to have an editor. And it takes a while for people who aren't professional writers to realize the benefit of having an editor. But that's effectively what you're doing here, is you're creating a layer of editorial control over other people's words. And after a few experiments at it, most people start to see the wonder and joy of it, because they start to see, wow, hang on a minute, this finished piece of work that's got my name at the top, it reads really well and it sounds really good. And that's only because my colleagues chipped in and told me where it was rubbish in the first place. So trying to make the whole process sound like it's an act of giving. That's what it is. When you're editing somebody, you are giving them something good. You are giving them something useful and helpful for them. So when people are resistant to it, try and make it more about giving than telling them what's wrong, but also encourage them to start with a bad first draft that is worse, because the less emotional attachment they have to their bad first draft, the more willing they will be to see it edited. This is why I often say to people, make your bad first draft as bad as you can. Make it awful so that you know that it will be improved when other people chip in.
Great. And there's been a couple of other really good tips on that in chat. So firstly, I think Tom said maybe clarify what kind of feedback they want. So kind of start that kind of conversation going. And also Rachel talked about involving users and user engagement, because often user feedback is very powerful motivation. If we've got time for one little question, Will, who works for Science Charity, said there's issues about consistency of tone of voice. So certain types of comms aimed at sciencey people and other people on very warm, fuzzy engagement, I presume, with supporters. And yeah, have you any thoughts on that, Giles?
It's hard when you're talking about technical subjects, but at the same time, I often, and I do this in the book, I make a comparison with TV scientists. And one of my favorites, for example, is Mary Beard, who is a historian of classical Roman history. If you Google Mary Beard's career, she has written hundreds and hundreds of books and formal academic papers, right? The thing about academic papers is that they meet a very specific user need. They are mainly written for the benefit of other academics. That's what they're for. But when you watch one of Mary Beard's documentaries on BBC4, you don't get a paper. You get Mary cycling around Rome on a bike in a bright yellow coat, pointing at things and saying, this is where that happened. This is where this other thing happened. That's where they stabbed Caesar, right? And what Mary is doing is creating layers. Her academic career is the detail layer. And if you've got the time and the inclination, you can go and read it. Her 1 hour documentary on BBC4 is a context layer. You can watch it on a Friday evening and you can decide for yourself at the end of it, do I know enough? For most people, yes, I do. For some people, no, I really want to find out more. I'm going to find some of Mary's books and papers and read them. Great. And then the lure layer, what's the lure there? It's the trailer that came on after EastEnders that was saying, if you want to find out about Roman history, watch Mary Beard later tonight on BBC4. There's a ton of stuff to explore about technical language. There's another good book called Docs for Developers about writing. I mean, that is particularly about software development documentation, but all of we don't have time to cover it now, but writing about technical stuff can be made easier by applying the layers concept and thinking about how TV scientists do it.
Great. Well, we've got just after 11 o'clock now, so we might need to wrap up quite soon, but it's been really wonderful to hear so much from your book, Giles, which is a wonderful read, and it's been a really interesting discussion as well. We've seen in chat a lot of people have been quite inspired by what they've heard, so they'll be going away and writing very, very, very bad first drafts, and we look forward to that. Is there any more from us, Ross, at this stage, just to say thanks again to Giles?
Yeah, I think, thanks to Giles, but also thanks to everyone who's contributed, and particularly in the chat box today. There's just been so many interesting insights and thoughts that have kind of built on some of these concepts and ideas. So it's been really good. It's been really fast flowing. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Really enjoyed myself, and thank you for all the great questions.
Yeah.
Get Giles' book.
Yeah. Get it now. Great. Thanks again, everyone. See you next time.